Welcome to Lesson 3 of our Python OOP Foundation series. If you're coming from JavaScript, Java, or Go, self is probably the thing that's been quietly bugging you. And here's the truth. It's not a keyword, it's not magic, it's just a parameter name. Python automatically passes the instance as the first argument to every method, and by convention, we call that parameter self. By the end of this lesson, both self and init will feel completely ordinary. So here's the roadmap. 4 mental models, and once they click, the magic just disappears. First, we'll see that self is nothing more than the first parameter name. Cart add x is really just cart add cart x under the hood. Then we'll master the shape of init arguments, learn the safe defaults that prevent the most common bugs, and finally, validate inputs at construction so the rest of your class can trust its own state. Let's start with the big one. In JavaScript and Java, this is a keyword baked into the language, but in Python, self is just a name. When you write cart.add book, Python quietly rewrites it as cart.add cart book, passing the instance in as the first argument. You can prove it by calling it that way yourself, and it works identically. You could even rename self to this, and Python wouldn't complain. Please don't, but the fact that you could tells you everything. It's convention, not magic. Now let's tackle the second piece of the puzzle. Init. Here's the truth. Init doesn't create the object. Python does that part silently. When you write cart, Laszlo, Python first builds an empty cart instance, then calls a init on it with your arguments, and finally hands the fully set up object back to you. That's why we say it initializes. It fills in the attributes on something that already exists. One call, one instance, at construction time. That's the whole life cycle. And once you accept that, init is just a function that runs after construction, its arguments follow the exact same rules as any Python function. There are really only 4 patterns you'll meet: required arguments with no default, arguments with a default value, the mutable default trap from Lesson 2, which you fix with the none sentinel and a one-line check, and keyword-only arguments, where that bare star forces callers to name the parameter. That last one is pure clarity at the call site. Cart, Laszlo, premium, true, reads itself. Now, here's where init earns its keep. Treat it as your single choke point for validation. Check the arguments and raise immediately on bad data. In the top example, nothing stops a balance of -500 from poisoning the object. In the bottom one, we reject empty users and negative balances right at the door. The payoff is huge. Once init returns, every other method can simply trust self.user and self.balance are valid. No defensive checks scattered everywhere. Validation lives in one place. That's the senior reflex. Let's put it all together in a class you'd actually ship. Name and email are required positionals. The bare asterisk says everything after me must be passed by keyword, so role defaults to user, and age is genuinely optional, typed as optional int. Then init does its job. Validate the email first, and only assign once the data is trustworthy. Required, defaulted, keyword only, optional, plus validation. That's the production shape of a domain class. Now let's lock in 6 reflexes that separate hobby code from production code. Always call it self. It's convention, but convention is contract. Type hint your init arguments for free quality from MyPy and your IDE. Declare every attribute inside amcoros init quay, never lazily later, so every instance has the same predictable shape. Validate before you assign, use none as a sentinel instead of a mutable default, and put a bare self in your signature to force keyword arguments where clarity matters. 6 small habits, and your classes start to feel native. And here they all are on one page, 12 patterns you'll reach for daily. The left column covers constructor shapes. no args, keyword only, validation, nullable. The middle handles arguments and guards, required types, safe optionals, top-of-function checks, and the manual self-pass that reveals the trick. The right column is your attribute toolkit, defaults, the OR idiom for mutable fallbacks, typed declarations, and the auto self-call you use every day. Screenshot this one. It's your reference card. Now, before you go off and write your own classes, let's talk about the 5 mistakes everyone makes exactly once. Forgetting self in the method signature, reaching for self outside the class, mutable defaults in read init, calling reinit by hand on an existing object, and stuffing heavy work like database calls into the constructor. Each of these has a clear fix, and recognizing them now means you'll debug them in seconds instead of hours. Time to put this in your hands. 3 exercises. First, build a user class with required name and email, a default role, and validation that rejects an email without an @ sign. Second, write a class using this instead of self. Run it, watch it work, and feel why conventions matter even when Python doesn't enforce them. Third, take the counter from Lesson 2 and harden it. Validation, type hints, a keyword only, start value. Finish these, and Foundations is done. And that's Foundations. You've demystified self, walked through the init lifecycle, learned 4 ways to pass arguments, and added real validation. From here, the series shifts into the daily track. Lesson 4 covers instance, class, and static methods, and the senior-level decision of when to reach for each. I'll see you there.